The Holocaust is undoubtedly one of the most tragic chapters of World War II. Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Treblinka. Today, every schoolchild knows these terrifying names. The history of the Jewish ghettos, which were created by the Nazis to isolate and destroy the Jewish population, is much less well known. Imprisonment in the ghettos became a death sentence for hundreds of thousands of people of different backgrounds and ages who were united by only one thing: their nationality. In this episode, we will talk about when the first Jewish ghettos were created, what their structure and rules were, and how the prisoners of such places lived. You will also learn what a ghetto actually is, when they appeared, and for what purposes they were created. My name is Semyon, and I'm kicking off the How Did They Live series. Let's start! A bit of history. The term ghetto appeared long before the Nazis came to power in Germany. Originally, it didn't have any negative meaning. Jewish communities in Europe always settled separately, apart from the rest of the population. In the 13th century, a royal decree was issued in Aragon, requiring all Jews to live in a specially designated quarter. Later, this practice spread throughout Europe. Separate Jewish quarters existed in the cities of Germany, France, Italy, Switzerland, and the Czech Republic. The name ghetto for such settlements appeared in Venice in the 15th century. At that time, there was nothing derogatory about it. That's what the Venetians called a part of the foundry, which, for fire safety reasons, was built far from the other buildings. The parallels here are obvious. By settling Jews in a separate district, the authorities of medieval cities sought to protect them from rampant anti-Semitism, which prevailed in Europe at that time. The medieval Jewish ghetto was no different from other city districts. Entry and exit were unrestricted. This term acquired a negative connotation much later, when any poor and overcrowded urban areas began to be called ghettos, where not only Jews lived, but also other ethnic minorities. Jewish ghettos in Europe survived until the 19th century, and they were mostly abolished during the Napoleonic Wars. The Roman ghetto lasted longer than the others. It was finally closed only in 1888. How did the Nazi ghettos come about? In 1933, the Nazis came to power in Germany. They made the superiority of the Aryan race the core of their ideology, and its eternal confrontation with global Zionism. From that moment on, anti-Semitism spread to literally every sphere of German society. Other nationalities and minorities also suffered from the Nazis, for example, the Roma or homosexuals. But it was the Jews who were considered the main enemies of the Third Reich. Adolf Hitler first spoke about the need to isolate the Jewish population in 1939. Although the Nazi leadership began discussing this idea much earlier, 10 months before the attack on Poland. At that time, the word ghetto appeared for the first time in official German documents. The Nazis began implementing this idea in September 1939, when 3 million Jews came under their control, living in the territory of Poland. However, the Germans not only wanted to deal with them, but also to get rid of people of the wrong origin from the Reich itself. Roughly speaking, Eastern Europe was regarded by the Nazis as a kind of dumping ground for members of the inferior race, who needed to be expelled to make room for the true Aryans. Oh man, what was going on in people's heads? The first Jewish ghetto was established in the small town of Piotrków Trybunalski in October 1939. And at the beginning of 1940, a large ghetto was established in Lodz. The Nazis accompanied the relocation of Jews with a powerful information campaign. For example, they falsely claimed that because of their uncleanliness, Jews supposedly spread infectious diseases. Therefore, they had to be isolated. Ghettos continued to be established throughout 1941. They appeared in Lublin, Vilnius, Zlochev, Krakow, Kaunas, Minsk, Bialystok, and many other cities. In total, more than 1,150 ghettos were established in the territories occupied by the Nazis. Over 1,000 of these were in occupied Soviet territories. The largest ghettos were in Poland. For example, 450,000 people lived in the Warsaw Ghetto, more than 200,000 lived in the Łódź Ghetto. On Soviet territory, the largest were the Lviv and Minsk ghettos. Respectively, there were 180,000 prisoners. There was even one ghetto outside of Europe, in Shanghai. There, Germany's Asian allies, the Japanese, gathered not only local Jews, but also all Americans and Europeans living in the city. The threshold of hell. By the end of 1941, the Reich leadership faced a question: what to do next with the ghettos? By that time, there were more than 1 million Jews in them. The death rate among the prisoners was off the charts. The reason for this was the terrible overcrowding and unsanitary conditions. There was no proper food, warm clothing, or medical care. It was clear that this wasn't what bothered the Nazis, but rather the enormous amount of resources that was being spent to maintain all of this. It's important to make an important digression here. The thing is, after coming to power, the Nazis did not immediately switch to a policy of total genocide against the Jews. Almost until the beginning of World War II, they tried to force the Jews out of the country and make their lives unbearable. The problem was that the Jews had nowhere to go. No country wanted to accept them. Even several international conferences dedicated to this issue did not help. People don't like to talk about it, but the so-called civilized world could have partially prevented the Holocaust simply by providing European Jews with refuge. But unfortunately, German Jews were refused entry to the United States, and Britain restricted their resettlement in British-controlled Palestine. In 1940, Hitler offered Stalin to take all the German Jews, but was turned down as well. After the Nazis occupied France, there was a serious discussion about a plan to resettle all European Jews in Madagascar, but this plan was never implemented. In the pre-war years, 330,000 Jews managed to escape from Germany and Austria. Another 100,000 moved to neighboring countries, but they were persecuted during the war. At the beginning of 1942, the Nazi leadership approved a monstrous plan for the final solution to the Jewish question, which involved the mass murder of the Jewish population of Europe. It was from this moment that the terrible death camps began to operate at full capacity, and the ghettos turned into transit points where Jews waited to be sent to the gas chambers. How did the prisoners of the ghettos live and die? As a rule, the ghetto was a separate district or street, cut off from the outside world by barbed wire or a solid wall. Usually it was located in the poorest and most underdeveloped areas of the city. When moving to the ghetto, Jews were only allowed to take personal belongings with them. All other property had to be left behind. The inhabitants of the ghetto were strictly forbidden to leave its territory under penalty of death. They could only do so with special permission. A random person who happened to get too close to the checkpoint could be shot by the guards without any investigation. A distinctive feature of all Jewish ghettos was the extremely high population density. For example, in Warsaw, 146,000 prisoners were crowded into just 1 square kilometer. In the Piotrków Trybunalski ghetto, 20,000 Jews were relocated to an area that had previously been home to 6,000 residents. The Nazis deliberately restricted the supply of food to the ghettos, so hunger was the main cause of the high mortality rate among the prisoners. Former ghetto prisoner Yakov Zilberstein recalled how his mother would cook soup from weeds, and potato peels were considered a real luxury. The guaranteed daily ration for a ghetto resident was only 300 calories, while an average adult needs 2 to 2.5 thousand
калорий в день.
The only way to get food was through smuggling from the outside world, and that was neither easy nor safe. Attempting to bring food into the ghetto was punishable by execution, but even under such conditions, the black market thrived. The Germans and collaborators from the local population took advantage of the desperate situation of the ghetto prisoners, trading ordinary food for their valuables. In the summer of 1940, hunger riots broke out in the Łódź Ghetto, after which the Nazis allowed Jews to work and buy food. Moreover, the ghetto administration was allocated 3 million Reichsmarks to set up workshops. The Nazis generally tried to hand over the management of everyday affairs in the ghetto to the Jews themselves. For this purpose, special self-governing bodies were created, Judenrats or Jewish committees. Their functions included organizing economic life, maintaining order in the ghetto, supplying food, and selecting people for forced labor. The so-called Jewish police was subordinate to the Judenrats. In addition to oppression from the Nazis and the collaborating Judenrats, ghetto inmates often faced injustice from their fellow Jews as well. A peculiar class system quickly developed in the large ghettos. At its top were the members of the Judenrats and the police. Next were the wealthy Jews, who had the means to buy food and necessities, as well as those who had access to the outside world and could smuggle in goods and food. Below them were people who had skills useful in the ghetto, such as doctors or craftsmen. Social inequality led to frequent conflicts among the residents. This only played into the hands of the Nazis. It should be added that not all members of the Judenrat cooperated with the Nazis for their own benefit. Many used their position to help their fellow Jews, although there were also plenty of outright scoundrels among the collaborators. It should be said that the rules and regulations in different ghettos varied significantly. Many small ghettos had open entry. However, the Jews themselves were strictly forbidden from leaving their boundaries. Usually there were few Germans there, and the local authorities often turned a blind eye to many violations. Eyewitnesses recall that in some small ghettos, religious services were even held. Resistance in Jewish ghettos. Despite the nightmarish conditions, the residents of the ghettos did not give up and tried to maintain at least the appearance of a normal life. Neighbors took in orphan children, and volunteers organized field kitchens where they tried to feed the weakest. In many ghettos, schools operated which was strictly forbidden by the Germans. If discovered, not only the teachers but also the students faced punishment. Various cultural events, concerts, lectures, and performances were organized in the ghetto. Usually the proceeds went to help those most in need. There were courses where enthusiasts taught anyone interested various useful skills, from cooking meals with minimal ingredients to making souvenirs. Obviously, there wasn't much practical benefit here, but this kind of activity helped people fill their foundation, to exist with meaning and not go insane. Active forms of resistance included escapes from the ghetto, smuggling prisoners to neutral countries, or joining partisan groups. Special shelters, so-called bunkers, were created in the ghetto where Jews hid from regular raids and extermination actions. Underground groups operated in many ghettos. They engaged in propaganda and spread truthful information about the situation of the people. Sabotage and subversive attacks were carried out on various fronts. It was not uncommon for ghetto prisoners to take up arms against their tormentors. And the most famous of such cases is the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto. It began in April 1943 after Himmler ordered the final clearing of the ghetto and the deportation of its inhabitants to Treblinka. By that time, a Jewish combat organization had long been operating in the ghetto. The insurgents managed to establish contact with the Polish resistance and obtain weapons from them. Therefore, when the Nazis entered the ghetto, they were met with gunfire and Molotov cocktails. The insurgents were well prepared for the defense. They dug a network of tunnels, prepared routes for moving across rooftops, and set up firing positions. After meeting resistance, the Nazis retreated, but this was only a temporary success for the insurgents. The uprising continued for another month, but the sides were too unevenly matched. The Germans brought in reserves, used artillery, armored vehicles, and even aircraft. The ghetto, along with its inhabitants, was simply burned and leveled to the ground. Between 7,000 and 12,000 people died. The Germans sent some others to death camps or executed them. The punitive forces lost only a few hundred men. The commander of the punitive operation, Gruppenführer Jürgen Stroop, personally blew up the main synagogue in the ghetto, thus marking the defeat of the uprising. Later, while already in a death row cell, Stroop would theatrically and openly talk about the atrocities committed by the Nazis during the suppression of the uprising. The Warsaw Ghetto uprising was doomed to fail from the start, but it became an undeniable moral victory for the prisoners of the ghetto. They showed that even in the most hopeless situation, it is always possible to preserve one's dignity, even at the cost of one's own life. In those tragic days, one of the Warsaw insurgents wrote, "We are not going to save you. None of us will survive. We want to save the honor of our people." After Warsaw, uprisings swept through other Jewish ghettos. And in August 1943, the prisoners of Treblinka rose up against the Nazis. In August 1944, the Germans liquidated the last functioning ghetto in Łódź. Most of its inhabitants were sent to Auschwitz, where gas chambers awaited them. A few words in conclusion. Human history is full of genocides. More than once or twice, it has happened that the people of some country were completely wiped out by conquerors. This continued right up until the middle of the last century, when humanity finally decided to put an end to such practices. The atrocities committed by the Nazis against the Jewish population so horrified the world that it said, "Never again." Today, genocide is perhaps the most terrible crime a country or an individual politician can be accused of. Unfortunately, not everyone understands where the belief of certain peoples in their own exceptionalism and their contemptuous attitude toward other nations leads. The lessons of history have not been learned. And that means history can repeat itself. See you in the next episode. Bye.